The basis of what anarchists wanted was that they believed that people couldn't be forced into cooperating with their government. They thought that volunteering was the only way for society to be functional. They opposed state and capitalist economies, and they thought that society should be alienated from the political process. They wanted the emergence of a society based on personal freedom, autonomy, and justice. It was a primarily Western European phenomenon and had greatest appeal in less industrialized countries. Anarcho was a syndicalist union which opposed improving wages, working conditions, and hours because they thought that the existing system shouldn't be cooperated with. They thought that the benefits of the system shouldn't be accepted because that was a sign of cooperation. An example of this is that workers were to be ready by completing acts of direct action which were to maintain worker solidarity. They didn't advance the revolution, but they helped workers remain aware of their exploitation. And so, a specific example is that barbers would purposefully nick their customers every once in a while to raise the level of commitment to their cause.
Not all types of anarchy is the same, but all anarchists had one goal, and that was a future of no constraints and like a society of not being controlled. And the way sometimes anarchists got this across was sometimes choosing violence to like bombing or vandalizing. But not all anarchists chose the route of terrorism, but all of them had the intent on revolution in society. Anarchists wished that the capitalist society would collapse and they would expose all the errors it held. And then a quote from the book is, "They disdain the tyranny of new organizations and bureaucracies that worked for gradual reforms at the expense of principles of justice." Anarchy appealed to loners, which were people who didn't partake in everyday society, and also the poor, because the poor never really benefited from the capitalist system that was in action.
There were a few important people who stood out in the anarchist movement. The first one was Mikhail Bakunin. He was a member of the Russian nobility, and he was Europe's leading anarchist spokesman. He advocated the use of violence because he believed that they could achieve liberation with violence. He believed that all existing institutions of government had to be swept away or destroyed so that people could come together and unite. There was a guy named Ravachol who captured the public's attention with terrorism. He saw government and capitalism as something that needed to be destroyed with violence. Then there was Prince Peter Kropotkin, who advocated a joining of communism and anarchism where people work together voluntarily but without the government forcing them to. And then there was Georges Sorel, who predicted a sort of judgment day when people would overthrow the government and justice would prevail. And he wrote a book to capture the anarchist philosophy and spread it across the continent.
What is socialism? It's the rejection of the known world, and they reject individualism in favor of the community. They believe that the revolution would eliminate poverty and suffering for the middle class. Many socialists came from England and France, and they were very radical thinkers. And the whole kind of idea and what socialism stemmed from was the inequality the Industrial Revolution created. And they wanted equal distribution of wealth, and extreme socialists believed they needed to transform society into small communities, and with those small communities there would be no private property. And also the Utopian Society book kind of influenced this, and very extreme socialists believe that this revolution could only be achieved by a revolution of only the working class.
The Communist Manifesto was a political document made in 1848 by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. The Communist Manifesto spoke about the problems with capitalism and capitalist production. The goal was to shine light on these issues while attempting to explain the goals of communism. The manifesto summarizes Engels and Marx's ideas that class struggles are a result of historical development. They argue that class relationships go hand to hand with an era's means of production. The manifesto states that although development is inevitable, capitalism is entirely unstable. The Communist Manifesto has 4 sections, discussing the theory of communism and relationships between many groups of people, including the proletariat and bourgeoisie and the communists. It also speaks about the flaw in previous socialist literature. The Communist Manifesto was later recognized as one of the world's most influential political documents.
3, 2, 1.
Well, why socialism is the best is because you see proper workplace democracy where the workers control the means of production and get the full fruits of their labor rather than having some abstract figure like a boss take their labor from them and take the profit from them like surplus value. Then you will also see an end of imperialist wars around the world which kill millions of people every year, and there's tons of suffering around the world simply because of first world countries wanting profit. And you will also see an end to recessions and all that because they only exist in a market economy. If you looked at the Soviet Union, it never went into recession. It actually went from being a backwards third world country to being on parity with the United States over the course of 30 years.
Okay, so there was many new socialist thinkers at the time. One of them was Henry de Saint-Simon, who was from France. He rejected liberal individualism and he was in favor of social organization. He was also considered the father of French socialism, and he believed that productive people would be the most elite people in his ideal society. There was also Charles Fourier. He devoted himself to the study and improvement of society and formulated one of the most trenchant criticisms of capitalism. And then there was also Joseph Pierre Proudhon. He refused to accept the dominance of industrial society. He believed in a just society, free credit, and equitable change, and all socialists at the time believed that a revolution would change poverty and the sufferings of the working class.
Nationalism defined: loyalty and devotion to the nation or state of an individual's nationality or heritage. After 1815, national identity and political allegiance became a large factor in forming nations and unity. Nationalism occurred in many places in Europe, mostly within the lands previously ruled by the Habsburgs. Germany, Italy, and France were of the many countries participating in nationalistic ideas. Some of those ideals included the people against absolute kings and foreign oppressors, inspiration of new symbols like the French tricolor flag, and the newfound value of individuality and authentic language and folklore from their country. All of these nationalistic ideals contributed to the importance of the state.
Some of the factors that helped out Germans' nationalism included economic, cultural, military weakness, and the effects of the French Revolution. Something that also helped was the Brothers Grimm. They published folk tales. Some of them are widely known still today, such as Cinderella and Snow White. They were used to foster out nationalism, and the folk tales during this time tended to be a little bit more violent than we see today. The brothers believed that national identity should lead to national political unity. The first German nationalists were inspired by the French Revolution ideas of liberty and nationalism. They hoped that the invading French would free and unite them to do the same. Napoleon provoked strong nationalist feelings in the Germans, and throughout the 19th century, the populations of separate states began to develop a sense that they were not just citizens of their own individual state, but they were also a part of the German folk.
The Italian middle-class intellectuals and professionals advocated for the idea of national unification of Italy and the ejection of the Austrians and Pope. Giuseppe Mazzini started the Young Italy movement, which was founded in 1831. Pope Pio IX was removed from office, and there was a republic declared in 1849. Mazzini became the head of the republic. The Pope asked for the French to help him get him back in the office, and months later, the French overthrew the republic, and the Pope was back in power.
Is the national movement of Jewish descent. It supports the reestablishment of Jewish homeland in the historic land Israel. Reasoning for this reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in Israel was because of the ingathering of foreign exiles and the liberation from the anti-Semitic discrimination and persecution that these Jewish folks were facing during this time.
Theodor Herzl was an Austro-Hungarian journalist, playwright, political activist, and writer. He's one who formed a Zionist organization. He's often referred to as the spiritual father of the Jewish state. He promoted Jewish immigration to Palestine to form a Jewish state. He's the father of modern political Zionism. He's also the first president of the World Zionist Organization, and he died 40 years before the establishment of the State of Israel.
Okay, so Zionism has created anti-Zionism movements. These groups these groups are mostly made of Palestinians and African Americans. Palestinians see Zionist movement as racist and colonialist, and they believe that the lands of Israel are their own since they've lived there for hundreds of years, and the British promised it to them after the First World War. And a lot of African countries and Muslim people support anti-Zionism, but some people that see anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic, Semitism, so they believe it's not against the movement but against all Jews.
After 1815, many national boundaries were being redefined. This constant change and redefinition was powered by the newly invented and highly used steam engine. As less humans were needed for production, more individuals had the time and capability to come up with these new ideologies. As intellect flowed, more and more people started challenging the ancient governments and the ideals behind them, leading Europe into a whirlwind of new thought and change. As time went on, many of these freethinkers started to organize and propagate themselves into the world's eyes. An early case of this came in 1830 in Great Britain. As pressure rose, a change was boiling. Those in power believed that only the rich and vastly wealthy who owned large sums of land should be allowed to vote. And sadly, most of Britain was controlled by these wealthy aristocrats. But the crippling fear of a civil war consumed the government's mind. And in 1832, the Great Reform Bill was passed. While still not allowing the vast majority of the population to vote, it did, however, enfranchise most of the middle class and provide power to the middle class and elite of small towns and villages. It also opened the gateway for new political parties to form, along with easing the implementation of social reforms across Great Britain.
In 1840, women started working in factories. Although this was a step up from women only being able to work in their homes, they still didn't have the same rights as men. They were being paid less and worked more hours. They were opposed to this, but they didn't want to speak up in fear of losing their jobs. While some women were scared, others weren't. Flora Tristan, a popular activist for feminism at the time, traveled across Europe and France giving speeches to others that were interested in the same thing that she was, which was women's rights. She created groups, some involving men, to fight against the unfair treatment of women in the workforce. Although women's wages didn't get higher, she still helped spread the word that women were getting treated badly in factories. Some women even had to work from their homes. This was called sweated hours because they worked really long and they weren't getting paid as much as women who were also working in factories. She wrote a book called La Union Ouvrière, which argued for women's education because women were the source of the betterment of society.
From 1838 to 1848, a group known as the Chartists, led by a small group of labor leaders, including representatives of the London Working Men's Association, petitioned for a document known as the People's Charter. This document pushed for equal vote, salaries for parliamentary service, annual elections, and equal election districts. These are all things that were not solved by the Great Reform Bill that the London working class was very upset about. Fergus O'Connor and Broncher O'Brien from Ireland led poorly organized, unskilled working class citizens in strikes that sometimes turned violent against the inequalities of the London government. They became Chartist heroes, and the movement spread among working class and women. This movement also became more popular in times of economic hardship. Chartists had meetings in houses, and women set up Chartist schools and Sunday schools to support the movement and its teachings. This movement culminated in the March on the House of Commons in 1848. They were pushing for one final chance at the petition being passed by the House.
They were met by a force of constables, which were really deputized private citizens and property owners and skilled workers of London, who did not want the movement to continue on because they wanted to keep their wealth and their jobs. Eventually, cold and rain pushed the protesters away, and after that, the movement fizzled out, and conditions became worse.
After the French Revolution and the end of the 18th century, liberal thought was ignited across Europe. Even some Republicans, Bonapartists, and constitutional monarchists cooperated as liberals because they wanted to carry on movements like those made during the French Revolution with a more organized government. Liberalism is based on two main beliefs: that the individual should be free and authority is easily corrupt. This stems from enlightened rationalism, which embraced the right to vote, civil liberties, legal equality, constitutional government, parliamentary sovereignty, and free market economy. Overall, liberals believe that humans are good and need freedom to flourish. Therefore, the government should support this freedom by being less influential in the lives of the individual.
The Anti-Corn Law League was a British organization founded in 1839. It was devoted to fighting England's corn laws, which were regulations governing the input and export of grain. It was led by Richard Cobden, who saw the laws both morally wrong and economically damaging. The League mobilized the industrial middle classes against the landlords, and Cobden won over the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. The corn laws were repealed in 1846. Go ahead. Just like Bentham, John Stuart Mill was an exponent of utilitarianism. He was prominent as a publicist in the reforming age of the 19th century and remains of lasting interest as a logician and an ethical theorist. In his view of utilitarianism, he included in utility the pleasures of imagination and the gratification of higher emotion, and to make a place in his system for settled rules of conduct.
Jeremy Bentham was a chief expounder of utilitarianism. His first book, A Fragment of Government, is said to mark the beginning of philosophical radicalism. It is also a good essay of sovereignty. He founded the Westminster Review to spread the principles of philosophical radicalism. Another one of his books, The Defense of Usurgy, showed him as a disciple of Adam Smith, but one who argued Smith did not follow the logic of his own principles. In the Manual of Political Economy, he gave a list of what the state should do and what it shouldn't do, the second list being much larger than the first. In the introduction of the principles of morals and legislation, he defined the principles of utility, that mankind was governed by two sovereign motives, pain and pleasure, and that utility recognized the state affairs. His last book, A Catechism of Parliamentary Reform, was about advocating annual elections, equal electoral districts, a wide suffrage, including women's suffrage, and the secret ballot.
Edmund Burke was a big figurehead for the conservative movement, basically because he was a leader of a couple different Whig parties, which were like a counter movement against the revolutionary mindset that was taking place. He believed that the strengthened king created stability for a nation, and that's how true happiness was found. His mindset was more stability over freedom. He was elected Member of Parliament for Bristol, and he held the position for 6 years before leaving. He was quoted saying the role of the Member of Parliament should be a representative, not a delegate, pledged to only undeniably see fit to the wishes of the people. He believed in a pragmatic policy which was based on circumstance, utility, and moral principle. He said there was danger in democracy and he wanted war against France. However, for figureheads like Clemens von Metternich, he wanted France to be able to stay intact, and he created a German union that he brought to the... He believed that the monarchy should hold power, and he thought that by abolishing ideas like constitutions and parliaments, that the king could have full and complete power, and that through the king having power, eventually liberty could be found.
I'm ready.
people a part of the conservative movement were the people of power and of the monarchy. It only benefit themselves, and the people against it were the workers who believed that they should be able to govern themselves.
Ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So, conservatism is not a rejection of political, economic, or social change. Instead, it represents a dynamic adaptation to a social system in transition. It valued corporate nature of European society over individualism, and organic growth and tradition was held over reason and progress. Basically, conservatism supports monarchy in the old ways before the Revolution and the Reign of Terror. It argued for prudent and gradual change to be made as slowly as possible.